NDISwrapper is a free software driver wrapper that enables the use of Windows XP network device drivers for devices such as PCI cards, USB modems, and routers on Linux operating systems. NDISwrapper works by implementing the Windows kernel and NDIS APIs and dynamically linking Windows network drivers to this implementation. As a result, it only works on systems based on the instruction set architecture supported by Windows, namely IA32 and x86-64. Native drivers for some network adapters are not available on Linux, as some manufacturers maintain proprietary interfaces and do not write cross-platform drivers. NDISwrapper allows the use of Windows drivers, which are available for virtually all modern PC network adapters. Use. There are 3 steps: creating a Linux driver, installing it and using it. NDISwrapper is composed of 2 main parts: a command line tool used at installation time and the Windows subsystem used when an application calls the Wi-Fi subsystem. As the outcome of an NDISwrapper installation should be some sort of Linux driver to be able to work with Linux applications. The first action the user does is to compile a couple or more of Windows files and the NDISwrapper's version of Windows DDK into a Linux kernel module. This is done with the tool named NDISwrapper. The resultant Linux driver is then installed, often manually, in the OS. A Linux application can then send requests to this Linux driver that automatically does the needed adaptations to call its now internal Windows driver and DDK. To achieve this compilation, NDISwrapper requires at least the INF and the sys files invariably supplied as parts of the Windows driver. For example, if the driver is called mydriver, with the files mydriver, INF and mydriver, sys and vendorad, product ID 00000000, then NDISwrapper installs the driver to, etc. NDISwrapper, mydriver. This directory contains 3 files: 00000000, conf, which contains information extracted from the INF file, mydriver, IINF, the original INF file, mydriver, sys, the driver file. Graphical front-ends. There are graphical front-ends to NDISwrapper, such as NDISGTK and NDISconfig, which allow NDISwrapper to be installed using a graphical user interface rather than console commands. Architecture. NDISwrapper enables a Unix-like system to use Windows drivers of type NDIS and Wi-Fi. It was useful at a time where there were no Linux Wi-Fi drivers for common Wi-Fi cards. It is composed of an NDIS driver, which is a kind of overlay for Ethernet device drivers, a Wi-Fi manager, to control the radio and security part of the Wi-Fi card. It exposes a wireless extension interface, a USB manager and a PNP manager to make it possible to use Wi-Fi card embedded in USB sticks. The USB manager is composed of 2 parts. First, a tiny USB-D implementation, USB stack, then a simple Windows driver model, WDM, USB driver that is itself composed of 2 parts. The front part will receive calls from the NDISwrapper USB stack. In fact, from calls coming from the original Windows driver that were normally intended to go to the Windows USB stack. And the rear part is using Linux USB stack. A minimal NTOS-kernel simulating the DDK for managing calls from the Windows driver. Managing IRP to the Windows driver. WDM only at the moment. Managing filter drivers in a simplistic way. Loading, unloading Windows drivers. A wrapper converting Linux calls to Windows and the other way round. Also managing results and error codes. How it works. NDISwrapper uses Windows INF files. When a Linux application calls a device which is registered on Linux as an NDISwrapper device, the NDISwrapper determines which Windows driver is targeted. It then converts the Linux query into Windows parlance. It calls the Windows driver, waits for the result and translates it into Linux parlance, then sends the result back to the Linux application. It's possible from a Linux driver. NDISwrapper is a Linux driver to call a Windows driver because they both execute in the same address space, the same as the Linux kernel. If the Windows driver is composed of layered drivers, for example one for Ethernet above one for USB, it's the upper layer driver which is called, and this upper layer will create new calls, IRP in Windows parlance, by calling mini-NTOSKRNL. So the mini-NTOSKRNL must know there are other drivers. It must have registered them in its internal database a priori by reading the Windows INF files. Similar programs. DriverLoader is a commercial tool produced by Linux and for Linux which seems to provide the same functionality as NDISwrapper, independently of but roughly simultaneously with the NDISwrapper project. Bill Paul of Wind River Systems developed a similar system, known as Project Evil at the NDISwrapper, for FreeBSD. It has since been ported to Dragonfly BSD and NETBSD. Limitations. NDISwrapper relies on the elderly, wireless extensions, to enable applications to access Wi-Fi. As NDISwrapper relies on Windows drivers, it only supports i386 and x86-64 architectures. NDISwrapper does not implement NDIS 6. Windows Vista version yet, limiting drivers to Windows XP. As of October 2013, a code branch at the project site has been under development since 2006. But a feature request from 2009 has been left unassigned. While it is not a major problem for the x86 architecture because of the popularity of Windows XP, x86-32, many vendors choose to make 64-bit driver versions only for Windows Vista, which means that Linux systems using the x86-64 architecture are unable to use such networking devices. They can neither use XP x86-32 NDIS 5 because they are 64-bit systems nor NDIS 6 64-bit drivers because they can't use NDIS 6. It's still possible to use Windows XP 64-bit drivers which implement NDIS 5. However, there are fewer available drivers for XP64, NDIS 5 64th-bit, than for XP32, NDIS 5 32nd-bit. Since 2006, most Windows drivers are compliant with Windows Driver Foundation, WDF, which NDISwrapper can't use. It renders NDISwrapper obsolete, as it only supports the previous WDM driver framework. See also, List of wireless router firmware projects. Cab extract. Deb. INF file. Librew. Linux Unified Kernel. ReactOS. NDISwrapper Wiki. NDISwrapper download area. NDISwrapper installation, an easy-to-follow video showing how to install NDISwrapper and get started with it. NDIS GTK. NDISconfig. Project Evil. The Evil continues. The 24th of January 2004. Bill Paul on a FreeBSD mailing list. Too Evil. Too Furious. The 25th of April 2005. Bill Paul on a FreeBSD mailing list. NETBSD NDIS driver port.